Today we're going to be talking about entering the Chef ecosystem with a Windows background. So, like Matt said, I'm a Windows guy. I've been doing professional development for the last 16 years, and until about a year ago, that all changed dramatically. I've been doing mostly Ruby development, not only cookbook Ruby, but gem Ruby. Like Matt said, I've participated in a lot of open source. So it's a big difference. And what I'd like to talk about today are about not only the technical differences, which there, obviously there are, but also about some of the cultural differences. So you definitely have two cultures when you're talking about your Windows technology and typical non-Windows technologies. There's a different expectation, I think, of what you expect from your software and how you consume your software. I'd also like to talk about what's involved when you make such a big leap in tools and skills. How do you go about learning a totally new operating system, a totally new language, all at once? So what are some tips and tricks there? And then once you do that, once you gain some competency there, how do you take that competency back to Windows? How do you take the things that you've learned with this new tool set and apply that to automate your Windows infrastructure? So again, just a little bit more about myself and kind of about my journey to where I landed at here. So, like I said, I'm almost my entire career has been working with Windows and Microsoft technology. Started off with Visual Basic 6, working with COM, also working with classic ASP 3.0. I was in the online ad serving business, and eventually I got to a point where I pretty much hit a wall with those technologies. I needed some concurrency, I needed more performance, so I did make a shift for a couple of years to Java. So Java on the server, writing ad serving platforms by day. My brother and I started a website and wrote a topographical map server by night and over weekends. So my ad serving was being deployed to Solaris 8, and my topographical map server was being developed on Red Hat. So I do have did that for a couple years. So I do have some of that background in Linux and non-Windows technologies. But then almost immediately when .NET 1.0 hit the scene, I made the switch back. It just made sense for me and my organization. Most of the people I worked with were skilled in Microsoft technologies. It was seamless to make at that time, certainly, to make the transition from Java to C#. And ever since then, up until about a year ago, I've been doing C#. So for the next 8 years, I've stayed in Southern California working the online ad serving business. But then I kind of have an epiphany. I got to a point where I was VP of technology for this ad serving business, and I just really felt like I was just kind of hanging out there for the stock options, which may never materialize. And now I know today they would have never materialized. And I realized I need to pursue my passion. So I went to work for Microsoft. I applied for a job, got a job up there, moved up from Southern California to Washington, and started off working in the MSDN and TechNet areas of Microsoft. So I was technical lead for the Visual Studio Gallery, and applied a lot of my performance things I learned in website performance there. We had a lot of performance issues, but eventually I moved into a lot of the code that you would say is the glue of those sites. So of the galleries, Visual Studio Gallery, the TechNet Script Gallery, the forums, authentication, and brought all that stuff together. And as I worked in that role, I became kind of the key point person for a lot of the infrastructure. I should say, I knew how the software needed to work with the infrastructure. So when it came to questions about how the software should be configured, I was the one to talk to. And eventually we got to the point where 60% of my time was spent troubleshooting environment issues. Troubleshooting why is it that every day I come in the morning and the test environment is just gone down the tubes. And so I'd have to either troubleshoot it myself, talk to vendors. We had an overseas vendor group that would build out these environments every day. And so one day I talked to one of the vendors and I said, hey, could you give me your scripts? Because I have a lot of knowledge about the applications that we run. I pretty much know how it should be considered. I'd like to kind of cross-reference that with your scripts and see if we can work out some of these problems. So what I got was a 50-page Word document of screenshots and narrative describing how to drag folders and click which next button to click and which finish button to click. And I saw 50 opportunities to make a mistake. I mean, really more. And I figured if I ever came in one day and everything was working, somebody deserved a major award, because I couldn't imagine how in the world that could happen successfully. So my goal then became to take that 50-page Word document and turn it into a single executable document built out of PowerShell. So this time I had never heard of Chef. I had never heard of Puppet or the tool set, Vagrant or any of these tools, but I had developed some skill set in PowerShell. The team that I worked most closely with, we kind of had a rule. You have to have a build.bat file in your repo, which is a one line that calls into a PowerShell and then builds out your whole development environment. But we didn't have something like that for our entire distributed application. We had distributed caching, we had we had clustered SQL Server. It was a fairly complex application, and all of that stuff needed to be scripted. So that's where I really kind of gained a love for this work, because I realized that there's an immense amount of value when you can take something that's incredibly, incredibly painful and time-consuming and remove that time and basically make it a non-event, a boring event, which is how every deployment should be. So it's at that time where I discovered Chocolatey. I'll be talking about that, mentioning that a little bit later, but basically Chocolatey is a package management system for Windows. It essentially attempts to fill a gap in Windows for a service that you have on Linux in apt-get and Yum. It's getting better and better. I became a core committer on that. I eventually started my own project called BoxStarter, which builds off of Chocolatey. And essentially, I wanted to be able to take a URL, walk up to a box, and build up that box the way I wanted to, as if it's just a matter of getting my text editor on there or a full build out. It's not appropriate for managing your server infrastructure. It's more for pets and not cattle. Let's just put it that way. So as I'm playing with this automation, I eventually do start hearing about Chef. I start hearing about Puppet. I start hearing about Vagrant and all these other technologies that sounded really super duper cool. And I just didn't have the time to look into it. So I eventually hit a point where I was doing a lot of this work at night on my own time. I had shifted roles at Microsoft. I was now mainly doing REST service work, which is cool. I like any kind of development, but this was really my passion. So I get a call from a friend of mine who I used to work with at Microsoft and said, I heard about this BoxStarter project that you have. What would you think about coming over to CenturyLink and starting a data center starter? Well, it only took a couple conversations and before I was hooked. I mean, that sounded pretty damn rad. So to be able to start a cloud as a greenfield project, I mean, that was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So as of a year ago, I've been working for CenturyLink Cloud. We're an organization, started as an organization that was acquired by CenturyLink. So we were tier 3 before that acquisition. And so we are a public cloud. We offer private cloud and hybrid cloud and all that. But my charter is to take our cloud platform and get that into multiple data centers and make that process as automated as possible. We want to get to the point where from a single command or a button click, a data center fires up. So been doing that for the last year. And over that process, I've run into a lot of open source technologies related to Chef, like Vagrant and Test Kitchen. I started a blog called Hurry Up and Wait. So a lot about the things that I'm talking about today, I try and blog regularly on that. It's just this year has just been jam-packed with learning. And I wanted to have a place where I could publish that, so that's what Hurry Up and Wait is. I'm always available on, or always respond on Twitter, MRockX. MWROCKX. So how might one react to coming from Windows to Linux as an automation engineer? So my initial reaction was it felt as though I had been wandering in the desert and talking to a lot of people that got it, but a lot of people that didn't get it. And suddenly I had found this ridge top. I come to this ridge top. I look to the other side, the automation community on the Linux side, and it just seemed like, okay, this is civilization. I mean, there's just such a rich community of automation tools that just don't exist at this scale on Windows. You had just Vagrant, all the configuration management. It was just, I was really kind of awe-inspired at what I found. I just felt like kind of a kid in a candy store waiting to play with this stuff. But eventually, reality comes and you got to get some work done. And so at CenturyLink, we chose to use Chef. I think that was the right decision. I've been very happy. But when we first embarked upon it, you start off you embarked to use Chef, but you realize Chef isn't enough. Chef is one piece of the grand puzzle. If you're being asked to automate multiple data centers, you need more than Chef. And so it can be rather daunting. You've got Chef, you've got BurgShelf, you've got all this stuff that you really need to know to make a full system. So the next reaction might be, oh my God. Hold on one second. This seems to be taking on a life of its own. Okay, stay. So the next reaction is, I feel a little overwhelmed. I have to learn Ruby. I've been doing C# for the last 15 years. I've got to learn, Linux. Yeah, I've done Linux 10 years ago, but so I've got to start with a new operating system, new Ruby. I've spent 15 years building up a particular skill set, and honestly, getting to a particular pay level. What does this mean? Am I gonna lose that? Am I now gonna be a junior developer? There's a certain amount of privilege that one feels when you can go up to your keyboard and feel like an expert, and it's hard to lose that feeling. There's days when you just wonder, why doesn't anything work? Like basic stuff, or what seems like should be basic stuff. Oh, there it goes again. And then a response might be, well, you got a problem with it? Why don't you send me a pull request? Well, so it just it can be done, and I've sent several pull requests, but you have days where it feels like you're underneath a waterfall of information. So what might one expect often in the Windows world, or especially in an enterprise environment, in terms of automation tooling? And one of the things that I used to find a lot, and I don't want this to be a bashing of these tools suck, because these tools have a place and they do within a right context. I think they serve many of the people that use them, but I would call them shining packaged monoliths. So you have kind of a one-size-fits-all tool that is kind of trying to be all things to all people, and it may involve a lot of dragging and dropping. And one of the problems is that they're usually closed source, so the boundaries in which you can work within these tools it's an impermeable boundary. And once you get to the edge of that boundary, you find yourself kind of building your own solution within that, coming up with kind of some wonky ways around it. And in the end, you might have a solution that's not really the solution you had hoped for. The other thing is that they're very difficult to source control. So oftentimes what you'll have these large text boxes that, yes, you have code, but you end up using the tool as a source control, or you have lots of large XML files that maybe you can export. But they really weren't meant for human consumption. They're almost impossible to diff and probably impossible to merge. So that's. But again, to be clear, I think there's a community for these. But once you scale to a certain point, these tools don't tend to serve you very well. So coming to the open source side of things, kind of what we might see in more of a Linuxy, Ruby-ish type of a community, like the community where Chef has its heritage, you typically see something that's more of a do-it-yourself type of ecosystem. So you're going to see more smaller, specialized tools, which can be good and bad. It's coming from a Windows environment. It's bad in the sense that, oh my gosh, how do I parse these tools? Because all of these tools many of these tools blend in just a little bit to one another. So when you're first approaching these tools, you're left with a lot of questions as, well, how does this tool differ from this tool? The other thing is that in order to create your system, you do have to work. You have to wire these tools up together. So it's great, they're composable, and you can end up with a solution in the end that can work much more with the domain of your business. Because you can basically take the same set of tools, wire them up one way, and then the exact same set and wire them up another way, two totally different businesses, and you can make things work. But it's the way that you string these tools together is not typically by dragging and dropping, it's by writing code. And so if you're coming from the Windows world, especially if you're coming from an IT pro background, and maybe you have little to no coding experience at all. You haven't had, for example, maybe you haven't had any PowerShell exposure. You're going to have a tough time. But regardless of whether or not you're making a move into Linux or Ruby, or if you're staying in Windows, you're going to have a tough time anyways if that's the position you're in, because that's the direction I think that just Windows management is going. But the fact that everything is programmable, the fact that everything is code, means that it can be put into source control and it can be automated much more easily. So, a question that I hear a lot, and I think a lot of people are curious about when they're first kind of playing around with Chef and they're coming from a C# Windows background, is, do I have to learn Ruby? I mean, because that's a daunting task, right? You've spent all this time learning this one language. You've learned the ins and the outs. It's one thing to learn how the language works. It's another way to learn the idioms of the language. It's a lot of work to learn a new language. And the response I often hear is, and I think this is true to a certain extent, is that if you're going to stick to the Ruby DSL, or the recipe DSL, and you're essentially going to be consuming maybe supermarket cookbooks or cookbooks written by somebody else that's more expert in your organization, and you just need to know that DSL. You just need to know the Chef DSL, which is very basic, and to a certain extent, I think that is true. However, if you're asked to, in my position where I'm asked to automate multiple data centers, I'm not going to be just sticking to the recipe DSL. You may find yourself in a position where you have to write drivers for Chef provisioning. You have to write drivers for kitchen. Maybe Chef provisioning isn't working for your particular scenario or some other thing, and you actually need to go into that project and submit some changes. My experience has been, the more you know Ruby, the more comfortable things will be. Now that said, there's no way you need to be an expert. I am by any means, have become an expert. I've been doing this a year. I'm certainly better off than I was a year ago, but it's a constant road of learning. And it may be that within your organization, just one or two people really have to be, strongly up to snuff with Ruby. Somebody needs to be. You're always going to find yourself in some kind of situation where you're going to need to know more. Gems start blowing up, and that doesn't require expert Ruby knowledge to figure out, but it requires some understanding of fundamentals. So one thing to be careful of when you're learning Ruby or Linux or a lot of these different tools is there's a lot of one-to-one mappings between these tools, for sure. There's a lot of very, very strong similarities. And so one example I like to give is NuGet packages versus Ruby gems. So NuGet packages has its heritage. I mean, it started off as Ruby gems. And now it's something totally different. But you can look at these two technologies and you can think on the surface that they're going to behave the same way. But you converge a new node and you wonder why what's Nokogiri? Why am I seeing, all of these gem dependency conflicts, or I can't load this gem or that gem? I didn't see this in .NET. Idiots. Who wrote this Ruby language? You go through these venting sessions of, this is crazy. And usually what this means is that it's time to take a look a little bit deeper and go into fundamentals, because typically, well, let me just say this. Anybody that's written a language or a packaging system that has the adoption that Ruby or Ruby gems has isn't an idiot. Typically what this means is there's some kind of a cognitive disconnect that you need to go deep into the fundamentals and figure out, take a step back and figure out what's happening. So it can be cathartic. Believe me, there's been moments in my team room where we've had these moments. Therapeutic to an extent, but perhaps not that productive. So, just some learning tips that I found helpful along the way, and also and some other things that I wished I had had. So one is full immersion. So given my own position, where at CenturyLink we have it's more than half is Linux. So I knew off the bat I was going to be doing a lot of work within Linux, and I knew I hadn't touched it in 10 years. So I made sure that my primary laptop at work, had Linux. Not as a VM, not as a dual boot, but as its primary operating system. And I would very seldomly go into Windows in a VM, because it was going to be a forcing factor to get me used to that environment. Was I less productive on day one? Absolutely. I remember, how do I copy a file? I've been doing this 15 years. How do I copy a file? It's CP, just in case you're wondering. And the fortunate thing about, a lot of these things, so there's just a lot of simple stuff. And you pick this stuff up very quickly. And things like this, there's not a whole lot of disagreement over the internet about how to copy a file. So typically you find out, it's a very straightforward answer that you find, very quickly. IDEs versus text editors. So if you're a C# developer, or .NET developer, you've likely spent a lot of time in Visual Studio. I've spent hardly any time in Visual Studio over the last year, and there's been some big challenges to that. Visual Studio gives us a lot of really nice efficiency tools. Give me a little Visual Studio, a little ReSharper, and I have to type a lot less. If you knew my typing skills, you knew how good of a thing that is. But there's something to be said about a text editor where it comes up super fast. I have just much less in my face. I can get just much more deeply. I feel like I have a much more immersive experience with the code that I write. But one of the things that you'll learn is that you have to read source control. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. At first it feels like, oh my God, what happened to the days when I could just hover my cursor over this object and it would just tell me what object it was and where it was coming from, or I could type a dot and I would get a drop down of all the properties and methods. So, which comes back to another kind of cultural difference. And this is my experience, so it might be different from your experience, but in my experience as a .NET developer, there's a certain expectation that I'm likely, when I consume a third-party library, a third-party DLL, let's say, there's a certain expectation that I'm likely not going to have to go into its source control. I'll probably be okay without doing that. Whereas I find in my exposure to the Ruby community, yes, you have Ruby docs. I personally haven't found Ruby docs to be much more helpful than looking at source control. I think there's just a much more openness and just a much more normalcy to going and just looking at the source. And I've found that actually has some very, very positive ramifications. One is you become much more intimately familiar with the code that you're interacting with. I read Chef source code every day. And because of that, there's certain areas of Chef that I feel like I know very well how it works. And it also gives me an opportunity to learn how I can automate Chef in ways beyond just using recipes and cookbooks. It's also a great way to learn a language. Even if you're an expert in a language, even if you're an expert in C#, I've always felt, and I still feel today, that when I look at C# code that's written by somebody that, by a very skilled C# developer, I learn things. I learn, new patterns and practices are emerging all the time. And the best way to learn that is to read that code. And then, if you get to the point where you can contribute code, and maybe just a couple lines at a time, you land yourself in a position where you're actually interacting with other people in the community, people who contribute and who own these source code libraries, and likely have much, much more knowledge than you do. I personally have learned a lot by doing this, by interacting with people like Fletcher and other folks at Chef and people on other projects. Just you learn little things rub off, which brings me to my last point here. Something that I wish I would have had that it just wasn't at my disposal. But honestly, if you do have the opportunity to sit within proximity, like to be physically close to somebody else who knows Ruby really well, that can be very good. There are many times when I knew I had a question that somebody that knew Ruby could probably answer in like a second. because it was something just just like a basic programming thing. And for whatever reason, my Google foo wasn't working that day. So that's nice. But even more valuable is somebody who could show me the Ruby way. So it's one thing, like I said, to learn how a language works, how to get something working in a language. It's another thing to learn the idioms of that language, which is, I find to be very important, because Ruby is different for a reason. And there's certain things that lend themselves, that Ruby lends itself to, that like making DSLs and meta programming that are really very, very powerful. And the best way to tap into that is by learning those Ruby idioms. So if you have that opportunity, that's great. So next, I want to talk about how, once you've developed some knowledge, how do you take that knowledge and get things to work with Windows? Because I personally think and have found that there are some special challenges in Windows, in automating Windows as opposed to automating Linux, for instance. So my first suggestion would be use the ChefDK. My team spent a lot of time in the beginning fighting with different Ruby environments, trying to figure out RVM, fighting with gems blowing up, or gem conflicts. And I look back to these times, now that it's been a year, I look back and just think, it's easy. It's just, I know now, but at the time when you're doing this, and there's just so many things, believe me, hours are lost in these problems. And if you use the ChefDK, so when the ChefDK came out, it was literally just like weeks after we started. It just makes everything so much easier. You've got one Ruby environment. You've got all most of your gems that you need are there, pre-installed. You don't have to worry about native compilations or any of that stuff. It's just all there and ready, and just cuts out a lot of the work. The other thing I would say, do not try to include Windows updates when you're provisioning nodes. So we thought, to us, it seemed logical. What else would you do the first thing after you provision a Windows box, right? You patch it, you make sure it's up to date with the latest updates. So, we worked and we got this working. We used my box starter project to get it would just reboot until all the updates were done. And, we spent a lot of time to get that to work, and then we didn't spend a whole lot of time after that to realize, this is not the right way. I mean, we looked like this guy. It just drove us crazy. So, because it literally adds like an hour, 2 hours to your node provisioning. If that's included in, like, for example, kitchen tests, it's going to make for a very long kitchen test and feedback loop cycle. So the other thing I would say is embrace DSC. So DSC is desired state configuration. It's the kind of the latest automation technology to come from Microsoft. I think it RTM'd about 1.5 years ago. It's extremely powerful, and it's very awesome. Essentially, for those that aren't familiar with DSC, think of a chef resource written in PowerShell. So DSC really kind of embodies the idea of a resource. So you have DSCs for installing, Exchange Server, DSC for doing all sorts of different things that are specific to Windows automation. And so there's two things in my mind that are great about this. One is a lot of these resources are being written by Microsoft. They're experimental, many of them, but at least it gets you off on the right start by having an expert that does this day in, day out, has already written these. Two, if you want to write them yourself, and you already have that skill set, if you already have PowerShell in your skill set, then you'll feel very natural doing this, because you can write a DSC, you can test a DSC, all 100% PowerShell. And then Chef, in a Chef recipe, you can consume that. So it's a very simple resource, and you can just consume that DSC resource right there inside of your Chef recipe. Yeah. Oh, thank you. So package management. So if you've done a lot of Linux work, you probably have apt-get and yum as just staples to your automation workflow, right? In Windows, yeah, we have there's MSIs that we'll say has been claimed to be a package management solution, but it's not the same. So Chocolatey is something that is very close to apt-get. You essentially do a choco and install. There's thousands of tools, online that you can install with Chocolatey, and you can also create your own packages and create your own repositories. So that's something to get to know. There's a Chocolatey cookbook, so you can again with it. It's just think of it as another package resource, just like Gems or apt-get or Yum that you can consume from a cookbook. But the packages are very Windows specific. One thing that I've found, just some gotchas that I've run into with Windows automation is PowerShell Remoting. So PowerShell Remoting is awesome, but it's different from SSH. And if your expectations are molded by SSH, your expectations may be you may have moments of disappointment. So all of this is workable. And I'll let you investigate the details. But essentially, you want to make sure that it's configured right. That's one of the biggest friction points I've had with PowerShell Remoting as opposed to SSH, where SSH is just there and it just works. Whereas PowerShell Remoting, you may have to configure the server depending on what version of Windows you're on, depending on whether or not you're in a domain or not in domain can affect things. You may not have second hop authentication, so you might be able to PowerShell into a remote box, but not get from there to like another, let's say like a UNC share off of that. So those are all things that they're not working. Because the other thing is when they don't work, it's not obvious that that's the reason why. And so what do you do when things don't work? So there's like 4% of scenarios maybe that you're going to have problems with. And typically it's anything that touches Windows Update. So if you try to run Windows Update through just directly from PowerShell, it's not going to work. It's just not going to work. Anything that touches Windows Update. So for example, if I want to upgrade or install the .NET Framework, the .NET Framework, its installation process will go out to the Windows Update server to grab bits and pull them down. That's not going to work. And you'll get something like an access violation or an H result. So it's not very clear, but there is a workaround. The workaround is to use scheduled tasks. That's what most people do. It's not the greatest workaround, but it does work. So basically, it'll run your process as a local under a local user account, which is the point of contention with Windows Update. It senses that you're remote, and it will. The problem is that it's a fire and forget action. So when you tell it to install the .NET Framework, it goes off and comes back, but the .NET Framework's not installed. So you have to put into your cookbook code that will essentially pull for that to finish. So maybe you find the MSI exec task and you watch that task for it to finish. It's not ideal. You're kind of blind to the output. There's some tricks there too. I've done some stuff, for example, in Box Starter where I start a scheduled task. You can grab that you can find that process, grab it standard in and out, and pipe it back to the console and make it look like an interactive session. But that's a lot harder than just running the command through SSH or PowerShell Remoting. But it's good to be aware of, because if you find yourself in a position where you need to automate that, that's your option. So, testing, 9 months ago, I was told that it wasn't possible to use Test Kitchen on Windows without SSH. As of this last weekend, Fletcher pushed an RC to Test Kitchen where that is no longer the case. You can test using Test Kitchen, and there's a pester buster. This is outdated terminology. We now call them verifiers. But so you can write tests in PowerShell. So if you're familiar with Pester, testing framework for PowerShell, I wrote the mocking for that. That's an option. So another area where you can kind of stick to what you know. And that pretty much wraps up what I have to say. Any questions, or do I have any time at all? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well. Oh yes. Yeah.
So, if master DSC, what benefit is Chef going to really give you?
So that's a good question. So DSC, you can think of DSC as a very, very small subset of Chef. So DSC fills in that resource gap, but with Chef, I get analytics, I get I get a whole Chef server that's managing all of my nodes. If you're in a mixed environment where you have Windows and Linux, you have the cross-platform support. But that's the main thing. It's just the DSC, at least at this point, is just it's a very small subset of what Chef has to offer. Yeah.
Is there a disadvantage of using DSC? If you're just starting from the beginning, should you just skip DSC, or if you're familiar with PowerShell, that it's actually good to use DSC?
I'd say if there comes a point where you have to kind of meter yourself where what you're going to learn and what you're not going to learn. I do think that overall, actually, it is good to learn. It is good to use DSC. Like even myself, I think moving forward, I would like to use DSC more where I can. Because one thing that's really the future of Microsoft automation. So you're kind of putting yourself on a good path there, where you're going to have a stronger guarantee that things will work moving forward.
Well, and Chef is my understanding is that Chef is going to cover with Ruby-based resources the most common things, especially things that exist like files and directories and groups, things that exist on Linux and Windows. They're going to cover that on the Windows side with a Ruby-based resource. But they're really looking to Microsoft, because Microsoft can release those DSC resources and those DSC waves much faster, and you're going to have everything that you can manage because Microsoft is committed to DSC for all of the products they release. So you're using Chef to sort of create those cookbooks and distribute those cookbooks that have the DSC resources managed those nodes, but the DSC is really the way to go.
Yeah, I agree. And, if you're talking about things like files, then it's debatable whether or not to use I would honestly, that's such a simple thing. But if you're talking about installing Exchange Server, I would go with the DSC.
What flavor? You mentioned references to Linux. What flavor of Linux are you finding best in your
Yeah, I'm really probably not the right person. All I can tell you is I've been working primarily with Ubuntu. We do a little bit of CentOS, but I'm yeah. Great. Well, thank you very. Oh yeah, yes.
So I saw a blog entry you did about sysprep.
Yes.
Cover how sysprep and domain joins and all that.
I don't know if I have time with that, but yes, so my blog, usually there's tiers behind every single post there, which those are always the best posts, right? But probably, we can talk about it afterwards. But there's just, it's kind of a deeper topic. Cool. All right. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Cheers.